I'm going to look at the demand side of what many of you have been talking about. And I'm going to start with when Pear's career started, which is 11,000 years ago. And if you look at Pear's resume, it is possible to believe that he has been writing for 11,000 years. This is the Neolithic period when agriculture began. And in fact, it's to the right, just to the right there of the dotted line. Recent archaeological research, fascinating research, was published in Science recently that had looked at over 130 grave sites of communities that were transiting from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. And what they found was very interesting. It was that clearly people had been, their diets changed dramatically. They were consuming much more high-calorie food. Their nutrition clearly had improved, and it resulted in a fairly substantial increase in fertility of at least 2 children per woman compared to the foraging societies of the same area. And it leveled out over a number of years to about 2, but it was about at the same time when mortality was increasing. And many of us thought that better nutrition would have brought lower mortality rates per 1,000 population. But in fact, because they had settled down, they were in fact being introduced to diseases they'd never been introduced to before, and it was all the zoonotic diseases. And they had, they got smallpox from cows, TB from goats, stomach ulcers from sheep, who knew, and caries from metabolizing all of the carbohydrates. And of course, the caries then produce the chronic diseases of heart and everything else. The archaeologists who have done this have called it the first demographic revolution. The demographers are ambivalent about having the archaeologists redefine their field for them, and have not yet accepted this definition. The result of this increase both in fertility and mortality rates resulted, however, the net result was a very small increase in population growth. And it was very small. If you back project it, it looks like it was about 0.05% a year, which is a very small number on this. 9,000 years later, there were about 300 million people in the world, but growth was still very slow. It took 1,800 more years before we reached the first billion people. And of course, it was Malthus who, at the time, predicted a global catastrophe. That the number of people were clearly going to outrun the food supply. And despite the fact that the catastrophe never came, he has remained remarkably popular among people who don't work in agriculture or population. The population growth rates in the 19th century and the 20th century increased, and of course it increased because of improving better public health and declining mortality rates. But agricultural productivity, because of you all, continued increasing faster than the population. I mean, when you look at this chart, which is just a scared chart that's been done by Population Reference Bureau, it is because of all of your research that almost all of these people had enough to eat. It's quite remarkable, frankly. By 1964, there were 3.3 million people on Earth, and the annual population growth rate was the highest it had ever been at 2.1%. This was the year that Pear published his first paper. Pear's, and I'm now digressing from my paper slightly, just to show you the intimacy of Pear's career with population growth rates, which he doesn't know. Pear's first paper was published in Danish in 1964. This was at a time when there were 3.9 million Danes who could read it, and only approximately, what do you think, Per, 100 were actually interested in it. So despite this limited audience for his first paper, the next year, world population growth rates stopped growing. Literally, I didn't make this up. It is to the surprise, let me say, of Paul Ehrlich. In fact, the population growth rate stalled. In the meantime, Pear had decided that he was going to need to publish in English to enlarge his audience. So he applied and was accepted at Oklahoma, where they speak a form of English, slowly. And four years later, Pear published his first paper in English called The World Food Population, A Look Ahead. Am I right? Yeah. Okay. And he's been revising that paper ever since, right? The next year, and again, this is absolutely true, the next year, global population growth rates began to decline. And they have been declining ever since. It's hard, this is obviously only a correlation, but it's so tight a correlation that it is almost believable. Today, the world's population has a fertility rate of about 2.5 children per woman, and is very close, obviously, to the replacement rate. And the population growth rate is now at 1.2%, which is remarkably low. You can't see it, of course, on this chart, but we're getting close to the top. And most countries have finished their demographic transition from high birth and death rates to low birth. Africa is the one continent, that has only begun its transition. But total fertility in Africa today, they started their transition in 1990, in the 1990s. But today, the total fertility rate is about 5.1 children per woman, which is still very high. Of the 31 countries in the world today, with fertility rates over 5, 29 of them are in Africa. And the last two are Afghanistan and Timor. But that's not the worst news about Africa, frankly. The worst news is that the most recent UN population projections have actually increased their assumptions of fertility and growth of sub-Saharan African countries. Not all of them. About a third have continued to decrease as we would have expected, but 2/3, and the biggest countries, they have readjusted upwards the assumptions they were making even just 2 years ago. There are reasons for that. The UN is always adjusting their estimates. I talked to the person in charge asking what was going on, that 2/3 were being adjusted upwards. And he said one reason was because they'd gotten more recent information from the 2010 round of censuses, so they have better data. But the second reason is they realized from information on the ground that they had been too optimistic. In a number of countries, they now feel that the fertility has stalled, and in some of the biggest countries, in West Africa in particular, they think it's increasing. It may not be true, but it was enough to make me quite depressed, actually. You know, I had taken my eye off of the increase in population in Africa because we had all seen them starting to go into the demographic transition. And the most recent projections suggest that that is really stalled. Their projections continue to assume that there will be continued declines in fertility over time, but just slower than what they were assuming before. And this is going to complicate because, as all of you have shown in the slides, because African agricultural productivity is lower than any place else in the world, having the population transition slowing is going to complicate each one of those problems. There are 3 reasons why I am not depressed now when I was thinking about it. One of them is that the education of women in Africa is continuing to increase, despite everything, despite economic declines and everything else, education is increasing. It is true that the fertility rates in Africa at every education level are higher than they were in Asia or Latin America at those same education levels. So it's not the same. It's certainly not the same kind of curve that we had seen in other places, but still it does go down over time. The other thing that is actually even more interesting to me is that Africa is continuing to urbanize. And the fertility rate in Africa of women living in urban areas dramatically changes when they move. It's a striking change in fertility, and because Africa is continuing to urbanize so quickly, I'm modestly optimistic that that will also have an effect on that the UN is not taking into account. They say they are, but I'm hoping that they are wrong, that it's going to be bigger than they think it is. But the third reason that I am relatively optimistic is because Pear published a book, The African Food System, in 2010. And given the high correlation of Pear's first 2 publications with the change in global population growth rates, I am hoping, Pear, that your book will have the same effect on Africa. Thank you.